Hi. In this video, I'll be doing something that I thought I'd never have to do, exploring the nature and value of free speech. However, it seems to me like we live in times that are increasingly calling for an analysis of this sort, so my plan is to produce a series of around 4 videos about free speech, and this one will be the first one in that series. Here are the working titles of the videos I'm planning. So, as you can see, I'm calling this video Setting the Stage, and it will be mostly about making some preliminary observations and then drawing out some conclusions, vocabulary, and values as a consequence. And I'd like to start that process by first addressing what I feel is a ridiculous red herring style argument that sometimes appears in discussions about free speech. And it goes something like this. Well, speech is never actually free. You can't just go around yelling fire in crowded theaters. Therefore, free speech of any kind is a complete illusion, and there's no problem whatsoever with any arbitrary diminishment or distortion of it. Oh, God. I call this a red herring argument because its primary effect is to draw the debate away from the actual issue at hand. After all, it's already self-evident that when we exaggerate free speech to the point of its cartoonish absolute extreme, it's not rationally or pragmatically defensible. So what's at issue here is not all of the practical constraints already coded into centuries of legal practice, such as those having to do with libel, sedition, and yelling fire in crowded theaters, etc. What's at issue is whether it's wise and desirable in our world to permit people the widest possible range of rationally and pragmatically defensible self-expression. Or, on the other hand, whether it's a better idea to diminish that range of self-expression whenever it starts to seem inconvenient. When someone is starting to feel offended, for instance, or when someone's personal ideological agenda is starting to encounter opposition. So, the point is that when I refer to free speech, I'm not referring to any sort of untenable red herring absolute, but to the ongoing practice of safeguarding the broadest possible range of rationally defensible self-expression. Second, it seems important to recognize that free speech isn't really free if we're not allowed to express certain types of fundamental human emotions. Of course, the same logic applies to ideas and opinions, but let's focus on emotions for a second because they seem more relevant to what's going on in our world right now. Let's take an example. Sadness. Our speech isn't really free if it's systematically forbidden to express sadness when we feel it. Let's say because someone has argued that expressions of sadness impose an unjust burden on people who are discomfited or disturbed by them. And even if we forbid only certain types of sadness, sadness expressed in certain ways or in certain contexts that have been officially deemed as inappropriate, well, that's still a way of undermining and vitiating the value of free speech in our lives. And if we take that project even further and succeed in codifying and banning something like sadness speech outright, perhaps by promulgating laws against sadness crimes of various sorts, well, that would constitute an even more absurd diminishment of free speech. That's because, at the end of the day, sadness is, well, just another human emotion. Just another aspect of life, just another part of the overall human experience. And if speech is to be free, it must be allowed to play across the broad panoply of basic human emotions, and not just the ones that someone has deemed nice, inoffensive, and, quote, appropriate. But, of course, not many people in our world are agitating for the prohibition of sadness speech. Well, not yet anyhow. I just mentioned that example as a way of demonstrating how absurd our world is becoming with respect to another fundamental negative human emotion, that of hatred. In fact, in our world today, many nations have recently instituted hate speech laws, at least for hatred expressed in certain ways and in certain contexts. But to me, it seems downright bizarre, not to mention futile, to try to legislate away basic human emotions that have been with us since the beginning of time. In the next video in this series, we'll look at the psychological reasons why trying to do that is extremely unwise and counterproductive. But at this point, let's just note that pretty much everyone feels hatred in one way or another. And pretty much everyone hates irrationally and unfairly too, at least now and then. In fact, I'd say that personally, I haven't encountered a human being yet who's immune from unreasonable hatred. Basically, everyone hates and everyone's a hater. It's only a question of how and when it announces itself. And consequently, the big elephant in our collective living room is that there's actually no such thing as a non-hater. It's a complete fiction, kind of like the ancient Greek centaur. Half man, half horse doesn't actually exist in reality. And surprise, surprise, the myth of the imaginary non-hater seems to be invoked and promoted mostly by people who have a hard time admitting their own sensations of unreasonable hatred. The kind of people who make an inadvertently self-referential project out of hating and oppressing people whom they've coded as haters, for instance. Of course, it's obviously true that some of us express our hatred more openly and directly than others do, especially others who are more adept at disguising it and hiding it from public view. But the point is that pretty much every single one of us feels some measure of it, whether we're willing to admit it or not. And it's not that hard to perceive that if we're paying attention to ourselves and to other people, and especially if we've had some training in clinical psychology. Consequently, to me, the entire construct of hate speech, at least as it's used today, both legally and informally, is mostly a kind of self-serving sham, a kind of theater revolving around virtue signaling. In reality, it's little more than a way of concealing the less pleasant parts of our humanity, most especially from ourselves, which ultimately makes them even more intractable and problematic than they already were. But beyond that, in my perception, the construct of hate speech is almost always about promoting a very specific underlying ideological and political agenda. In other words, contrary to popular opinion, the concept of hate speech is mostly a political construct, a generic, one-size-fits-all derogatory label we can apply to our political and ideological opponents in order to marginalize and silence them. Basically, the concept of hate speech isn't really about calling out the haters of the world or diminishing their influence, but about silencing any kind of speech that we ourselves hate. Okay, third, I've noticed over time that there's a puzzling lack of handy vocabulary to denote speech in our world that is not free, but that is controlled, regulated, or banned outright. Of course, the first part of controlling people's speech would naturally be to control the kinds of speech that would help us recognize and identify how speech is being manipulated and controlled in the first place. And because of that, at this point, I'd like to introduce the phrase enslaved speech to denote what would be the antithesis of free speech. The reason why I'm choosing a relatively provocative phrase like enslaved speech is that tamer phrases like constrained speech or confined speech seem more descriptive of the practical legal prohibitions that have already been coded into legal canon for centuries, and which cover necessary limitations like the prohibition against yelling fire in crowded theaters. But I want a phrase that describes the ways of diminishing speech that extend beyond all of that, the kinds that aren't genuinely necessary, but that are merely the product of arbitrary ideological preference or whim. Anyhow, in my view, there are two basic types of enslaved speech. One type would be compelled speech, which occurs when we force other people to use only certain mandated constructions, which once again I find almost always support a very specific underlying ideological and political agenda. An example of compelled speech would reside in the recent legal dictates of Canadian Bill C-16, which I suppose has become rather infamous in that regard. The second type of enslaved speech I'll call disallowed speech, which occurs when we force people to stop using certain long-standing linguistic practices, which are then regarded as taboo and barred from further use. I find that this too is mostly motivated by the project of promoting a very specific underlying ideological and political agenda. An easy example of disallowed speech would be hate speech, which we've already mentioned. But it would probably also include a large fraction of today's PC movement. However, in addition to introducing some handy vocabulary, I would also say that to understand free speech and enslaved speech in today's world, we would also need to say something about the psychological dynamics of being offended. That's especially true because the issue of free speech becomes salient mostly when people say things that we personally find objectionable or offensive somehow. That's because when everyone's going around saying only safe, inoffensive things all the time, the issue of free speech never arises, mostly because there's no impetus to question it. But when we're offended or annoyed, that's when we start to insist that it's time to start censoring people via the mechanisms of enslaved speech. And by the word people, I mean especially other people. We almost never seek to censor ourselves through enslaved speech. So, it would seem that we should try to understand something about the experience of feeling offended by other people's speech. And I suspect that the most critical part of this issue has to do with the values of tolerance and diversity, with whether we can tolerate the sensation of feeling offended when we're exposed to the wide diversity of human opinions and perspectives about almost any issue, especially when those perspectives are very different from our own. And when we're unable to be tolerant of that wide diversity of perspectives, that's when we feel the urge to control other people's speech so that it doesn't threaten how we personally want to see things. Basically, my sense is that when we're able to feel a basic tolerance for other people's diversity of opinions, it's easy to affirm free speech as a desirable virtue. But when we're mostly intolerant of that kind of diversity, that's when we start to justify and insist on enslaved speech in one form or another. Of course, it goes without saying that feeling offended is hardly ever a pleasant sensation. But the larger reality of life is that the sensation of feeling offended is not in itself anything harmful or without value in human affairs. When it comes down to it, it's really just another human experience, just another part of pretty much everyone's life. In fact, sometimes we desperately need to be offended, especially when we're deeply entrenched and mired in our own self-serving perspectives and investments, and could greatly benefit from being shaken loose a bit. That's when being offended can have real positive value in our lives, by throwing us back upon ourselves, by inviting us to question whether we really have the best answers to life's riddle, which in turn can open up the possibility of improving ourselves and growing as human beings. Okay, at this point I'd like to move away from looking at the sensation of feeling offended as the principal motivation behind enslaving other people's speech and spend a minute or two exploring the freedom of free speech. Of course, at the most obvious level, that type of freedom has to do with expressing our ideas, our emotions, our opinions, attitudes, and preferences, etc. However, at a somewhat deeper level, it also has to do with being the masters of our own thoughts, perceptions, and values, rather than having them be manipulated according to someone else's agenda. But at the deepest levels, it seems to me that the freedom of free speech is really about the authenticity of our lives themselves. And this is what makes free speech such a crucial issue in our world today. It's not merely because it allows us to express ourselves honestly and directly. The real underlying issue of free speech has to do with our existential condition itself, with whether we end up living our lives authentically or not. Of course, it's always tempting and easy for us to spend our lives kowtowing to other people's values and ideological projects, especially when we're feeling insecure about our own perspectives. But the ultimate cost of doing that is that we'll eventually become something that we don't really want to be, and end up living lives that we don't really want to live. And at that point, we'll simply become vectors for someone else's values and projects. And ultimately, we'll eventually lose our very souls in the process, and our lives. Our lives will become little more than a collection of cheap masks we wear simply to seem appropriate and hence acceptable to others. A hollow and feckless pantomime of real life. And if enough people start living that way, if living is the right word, then society itself will start to become similarly hollow and phony. Basically, a society of politically correct evasions and misdirections. A world of semi-totalitarian linguistic suppression, lacking the courage to name and discuss its underlying problems honestly and directly. And in my mind, there are no better historical examples of that unwholesome tendency than the 20th century's great despotic dictatorships, such as that of Soviet socialism under Stalin or National Socialism under Hitler, both of which were truly abysmal cases where an inability to tolerate a diversity of alternative perspectives, coupled with a thoroughgoing will to enslaved speech, predictably gave rise to deeply pathological and genocidal cultural conditions. However, I'd say that many of those same disturbing signs are present in less florid form in our own world today. Consider, for instance, the frequency of quasi-political mob violence in our streets that's basically motivated by the desire to enslave other people's speech. Or think about the ongoing deplatforming and disenfranchisement of purportedly inappropriate speakers. Or, to select a more specific example, consider the recent arrest and prosecution of the Scottish YouTuber known as Count Dankula for committing the most egregious and horrific thought crime conceivable in today's world. That of telling a silly, puerile, politically incorrect joke on YouTube. However, the sad reality is that Count Dankula is really just the tip of the iceberg. Many other successful professional comedians, seasoned veterans such as Jerry Seinfeld and Chris Rock, are now suddenly reporting feeling similarly oppressed by today's tendencies toward enslaved speech. In my mind, that's a telling and important indicator of our world's current trajectory, because when they come to control and enslave our comedians and our artists and any other creative free spirits engaging in free speech, well, that's when we can all be sure that we're dealing with a truly virulent sickness in our world. And it's a sickness with which very few people would actually enjoy getting down. Okay, as always, thanks for watching. The next video in this series will be on how psychology, and especially psychoanalytic psychology, can help us understand the dynamics of free speech and enslaved speech more deeply. See you then. Peace out.